Between Two Worlds. Episode 3. The Price of Knowing. There are things a person learns not by being told, but by the slow accumulation of silences, the pauses before answers, the rooms one is never shown, the names that vanish from conversation like stones dropped into deep water. The knowing, when it comes, does not arrive as revelation. It arrives as weight. She woke before the alarm, which was not unusual. What was unusual was that she lay still for a full 3 minutes after waking, a luxury, or something that resembled a luxury only if one did not look too closely at what she was doing in those 3 minutes, which was not resting but rehearsing. Running through the day's requirements the way a surgeon might review an anatomy before the first incision, methodically, without sentiment, with the specific attentiveness of someone who knows that a single forgotten detail can cascade into catastrophe. Ji-yeon Park's apartment was the kind of space that told you everything and nothing about the person who inhabited it. The walls were bare save for a single framed print of Ji-yeon in winter, chosen not because it moved her, but because it was the sort of thing that was supposed to move a person, the sort of object that communicated a certain respectability, a certain cultural rootedness, and Ji-yeon had long ago learned that the objects in one's environment were as much a language as any she translated professionally. The closet was arranged by color within category, darks to lights, and the section she moved to now was the professional section, which was in truth the only section that mattered, a row of dark structured pieces, cut to suggest authority without aggression, femininity without invitation. She selected the charcoal. She selected it the same way a soldier selects which armor to wear into a particular battle, not because she loved it, but because she understood what it would be required to absorb. The estate was on the outskirts of Busan, in the direction the city had not yet decided whether to grow or retreat from. That ambiguous geography where old money built walls and newer money built surveillance systems, and the two often overlapped in ways that produced a particular flavor of compound that looked, from the road, like tradition and felt, from the inside, like a mouth that had decided to close. Ji-yeon knew this about the estate already. She had been inside it twice before, once 18 months ago for a trade meeting involving a shipping consortium that the Brotherhood had an interest in, and once 7 months ago for a dinner at which she had translated pleasantries and watched a man laugh at a joke he had not found funny and understood, with the clarity of someone fluent in performance, that the laughing man would not be at any subsequent dinners. He was not. She stood at her bathroom mirror and applied her makeup with the care of a craftsperson finishing a surface that would be inspected under unforgiving light. Foundation, concealer at the inner corners where tiredness settled first, a precise line at the lash, color at the lips, not red, never read at these meetings, which would read as too much of a declaration, but a quiet rose that said composed and present and entirely uninterested in being looked at, which of course made one looked at. She knew this too. She had catalogued all the ways she was perceived and had long since stopped having feelings about any of them. Feelings about perception were a form of self-indulgence that she could not afford and had, she told herself, chosen not to afford. Which was not quite the same thing, but was close enough that she had stopped examining the distinction. What she had not stopped examining, what she could not stop examining, because it had lodged itself in her consciousness the way a splinter lodges and makes itself known with every particular angle of pressure, was what she knew about tonight's meeting that she was not supposed to know. She knew the official version, a territorial negotiation between the CO Brotherhood and a Yakuza delegation out of Osaka, centered on the question of port access, specifically. Which organization controlled the movement of which categories of cargo through which sections of Busan's international shipping infrastructure? A question that sounded, in its bureaucratic framing, almost boring. Almost like the kind of dry logistics discussion she had translated dozens of times, and which was in fact about the movement of quantities of money and material and influence so vast that even fractions of the percentages under discussion could sustain or destroy entire ecosystems of smaller operations for years. She knew this version. She was prepared for this version. What she also knew, and here the splinter found its deepest angle, the one that produced a sensation she refused to name as fear, but which sat in the cavity of her chest with fear's particular density, was that the meeting was not only a negotiation. It was a stage set. It was the front room of a house in which something else was happening in the back, and the back room concerned a man named Park Sung-jin. No relation to her. She had verified this the first time she had heard the name, some reflex of self-protection making her run the genealogy before she allowed herself to think about anything else, and the genealogy had confirmed what she already suspected. The name was common, the connection non-existent, and the relief she felt at this confirmation was immediately replaced by a colder, heavier awareness that the absence of relation did not absolve her of anything. Park Sung-jin had been, for 11 years, a senior lieutenant in the Brotherhood's Port Operations Division. He was a broad-shouldered man in his mid-40s who smiled with one side of his face more than the other, and who had, on the 2 occasions she had been in the same room with him, spoken to her with a directness that suggested he was either unaware of or unimpressed by the usual hierarchy of attention that organized Brotherhood gatherings. He had asked her once, during a break in a meeting she was translating, whether she found it disorienting to hold 2 languages in her mind simultaneously. And she had said something diplomatic and forgettable, and he had nodded as though she had said something interesting, and she had moved on. She had translated for him once, briefly, in a side conversation about logistics with a Taiwanese contact, and he had thanked her afterward with a sincerity that was neither performed nor withheld, simply present. And she had noted it and filed it and not known what to do with it, which was itself notable. She knew, because she had a gift for assembling what she was not directly told from the materials of what she observed, that Park Sung-jin had been speaking to someone outside the Brotherhood. She could not have said precisely how she knew this. It was assembled from the way certain conversations stopped when she entered rooms in the past month. The way C.O. Jaemin's assistant had twice made reference to tonight's estate gathering with an emphasis on discretion that was a fraction beyond what the ostensible purpose of the meeting warranted. The fact that Park Sung-jin's name had appeared on the preliminary attendee list and then been quietly removed, and then, this was the piece that made the shape complete, that made it impossible. To unsee the fact that she had seen, 2 weeks ago, outside the glass-fronted building where the Brotherhood's import consulting firm maintained its official offices, a child sitting on a bench with the particular stillness of a child who has been told to wait and has understood, in the way children understand things that adults do not say, that waiting is what is required of them right now. The child was a girl, perhaps 8 or 9, wearing a yellow cardigan, and she had been reading a book with the focused industry of someone making time pass deliberately. And when Park Sung-jin had emerged from the building 20 minutes later, the girl had looked up, and the expression on her face was the expression that appears on a child's face when what they've been told to hope for has, for once, come true. Ji-yeon had driven past. She had not stopped. She told herself, standing now at her bathroom mirror with a rose-colored lip color applied and her face composed into its professional expression, that there had been nothing she could have done by stopping. She was still telling herself this. The telling had not yet resolved into anything she could recognize as belief. She carried this knowledge the way a person carries a live wire, with both hands, with held breath, with the specific alertness of someone who understands that the damage the thing could do is not theoretical, but immediate and personal and without appeal. She could not put it down. She could not use it. She could only carry it, carefully, into a car that would take her to a gate that would open without her asking, and sit in a receiving room and wait, and then, when the men arrived, disappear into language the way she always disappeared into language completely. Gratefully, like a person stepping into a river and being taken by the current before they have fully decided to swim. At 4:30 in the morning, the Busan port was not silent. It was never silent. Not exactly, because the port was one of those mechanisms too large and too necessary to ever fully power down, but it had its own species of quiet. A hum beneath the hum, the sound of machinery at rest inside a structure that had not forgotten it was a machine. Marcus Quan Campbell knew this quiet the way he knew the particular ache in his right shoulder that meant rain was coming, or the way he knew the exact number of steps from the dock workers' locker room to the breakwater, where the light changed from industrial orange to something that had not yet decided what color it was going to be. He knew it by accumulation, by years of early mornings, by the kind of knowledge that lives in the body rather than the mind, and which the mind, if consulted, can only gesture it vaguely and say, yes, that. He sat on the breakwater with his thermos between his boots and his architectural notebook open on his knee and the city at his back and the harbor before him, going from black to the particular dark blue that preceded the dark blue that preceded gray. And he was drawing. He told himself he was reviewing his drafting homework. There was a structural elevation assignment due Thursday, a residential commission prompt, something about load-bearing walls and the relationship between interior volume and exterior mass. And his hand did move across the page with the purposeful fluency of someone reviewing technical forms. But the forms he was drawing were not structural elevations. They were not buildings. They were the line of a jaw caught at 3/4 angle, the specific architecture of a brow in concentration, a mouth that held something closed without effort, which was different from a mouth that held something closed with effort, and which he had spent approximately 45 minutes attempting to capture with varying degrees of success before he put the pencil down and looked at the harbor and acknowledged to himself nothing in particular, simply looked, the way a man looks at a horizon when he does not want to examine too carefully what he is looking at inside his own chest. He had not slept well. He was not a man who announced this kind of thing, not to Deoksu, not to the friends who texted him in the group thread about the football match he had missed, not to anyone. Because the announcement of sleeplessness invited questions about its cause, and he did not have an answer to offer that he was prepared to say aloud. He had lain in his apartment, the apartment that was small and functional and held his drafting table and his books and his grandmother's photograph and very little else, and looked at the ceiling and felt the particular restlessness of someone whose mind has decided to return, repeatedly, to a single point the way a tongue returns to a sore tooth, not because touching the soreness is pleasant, but because the soreness is there. It is real, and the reality of it is somehow preferable to the numb evasion of not touching it at all. He had met her twice. He corrected himself, internally and somewhat sternly. Twice meant a pattern, and twice in circumstances that could be described as coincidental meant nothing at all, and the feeling that settled through him like dye through water when he thought about the second meeting. The way she had sat beside him at the water's edge without any of the careful social calculation he might have expected from someone so clearly practiced in presentation, the way she had looked at him when he had said something small and true about the harbor, not with surprise exactly, but with the expression of a person who has heard a piece of music they thought only they knew was not a reliable foundation for anything. And he was a man who built things, and he understood foundations. He understood foundations, and he understood, with a part of his mind that was always quietly doing structural analysis whether or not he intended it, that whatever this was, the foundation was uncertain and the site was complicated and the conditions were not ideal. He understood this, and he drew her jaw again from memory, and the drawing was better than the last 6 attempts, and he looked at it for a moment and then closed the notebook, which was not the same as resolving anything. The estate announced itself through the car window as a theory of control made physical. The walls were pale stone, high enough to communicate permanence rather than merely privacy, and they ran in both directions from the gate with the unhurried confidence of something that had not needed to justify its own perimeter in a very long time. The gate was black, not painted black, but black in the way of things that have been finished to a degree that makes the color seem less a surface quality than an intrinsic property. And it opened as the car approached with the smooth inevitability of a mechanism that had never been made to wait. Cameras were mounted at intervals along the wall's upper edge, and Ji-yeon counted them automatically as the car moved through the gate and onto the inlaid stone drive. Not because she planned to do anything with the information, but because counting was something her mind did when it needed to keep itself occupied with manageable tasks. There were 9 cameras visible from the drive. There were, she knew from her previous visits, more that were not visible. The main structure was traditional in its bones, a Korean estate architecture that spoke of centuries of occupation by families who had understood that permanence was itself a form of argument. But its flesh had been altered by a renovation that had chosen, very deliberately, the aesthetic vocabulary of brutal minimalism. The wooden lattice screens had been replaced with black steel frames. The paper and wood paneling had given way to surfaces that were either stone or made to resemble it, gray and unforgiving, cold to the touch even in summer. The gardens were manicured into submission, pine trees shaped into forms so precise they looked architectural rather than botanical, moss maintained at an exact height, gravel raked into patterns that suggested either careful thought or the enforced labor of someone required to care. It was beautiful in the way that certain predatory things are beautiful, completely, coldly, without any apparent awareness of or interest in its own effect. Seo Jae-min's assistant, a young man named Choi whose primary professional quality appeared to be the capacity to say a great deal with very little facial movement, received Ji-yeon at the entrance and conducted her to a receiving room where tea had been set out and a window looked onto the pine garden, and the light was the controlled, diffuse light of a space that had been designed to be looked at rather than looked through. She sat. She arranged her jacket. She placed her hands in her lap. She waited with the practiced stillness of someone who understood that being seen to wait well was itself a form of communication. The Yakuza delegation arrived 40 minutes later. She heard them before she saw them, not because they made noise, but because the quality of the silence in the corridor changed, the way the quality of water changes when something large moves through it, even if the movement is smooth. There were 4 men. 3 of them were the kind of men who occupied space in the way of physical instruments, present, functional, dangerous in a manner that was legible and therefore, in its legibility, somewhat manageable. The 4th man was Tanaka Hiroshi, and he was not an instrument. He was the hand that held the instruments. He was silver-haired, perhaps 60, with a face that had been lived in carefully, not a face unmarked by time, but a face in which time had been accommodated without protest, the lines arranged into something that read less as aging than as resolution. He wore a suit so dark it seemed to absorb the room's light and return none of it. He moved with the stillness of someone who had, over the course of a life organized around the management of consequence, arrived at a state in which the conservation of movement was not economy but mastery. He had never needed to raise his voice. This was not an inference. It was a fact that his presence communicated without his doing anything at all, the way certain structures communicate their load-bearing purpose without requiring inspection. Ji-yeon translated. She translated the formal greetings, the acknowledgments of each party's standing, the careful orchestration of the opening statements in which nothing was said directly and everything was communicated precisely. She translated the territorial framework, the port, its sections, the shipping lanes and inspection schedules, and the particular hours that meant something different to the Brotherhood than they meant to the harbor master's official record. She translated the counterproposals and the amendments to the counterproposals and the pauses that meant something was being reconsidered and the pauses that meant something was being rejected and the pauses that were simply pauses. She was, during all of this, not herself. This was what simultaneous translation required and what it produced in her, a kind of productive self-erasure, a becoming conduit in which her own interiority was suspended in favor of the movement of meaning between languages, and there was. She knew this, had always known it, something that she could not honestly call anything other than relief in this suspension. In the space between languages, she did not have to be Ji-yeon Park, who knew things she was not supposed to know and felt things she was not supposed to feel. She was only the movement of meaning. She was only the voice that made one world comprehensible to another. But underneath it, with the persistence of water finding its level, the awareness moved. Somewhere in this estate, in a room she would not be shown, at the end of a corridor she would not be asked to walk, something was happening. Or had already happened. She could not know which. That was the particular torture of it, not the knowing, but the not knowing which kind of knowing she had, whether she was carrying current information or history, whether the weight in her chest was anticipatory or retrospective. She had no way to ask. She had no way to know who she could ask even if the asking were possible. She sat in her chair and translated with her full professional precision, and the awareness moved beneath the words like something alive beneath ice. At the Busan docks, the morning shift arrived and distributed itself across the infrastructure with the practiced efficiency of people who had been in the same places so many times that the places had shaped themselves to receive them. Marcus worked a container crane that morning. Crane work was not his usual assignment, but one of the regular crane operators had called in, and Marcus had his certification. And so he climbed and settled into the cab and looked down at the dock from the height that always reminded him, every time, of why he had started drafting, the way things looked from elevation, the way the geometry of it resolved into something legible, the way you could see the plan of a thing from above in a way you could not see it while you were inside it. He worked. He was good at working. It was one of the things he was most fluent in, the language of physical labor, the grammar of coordination and effort, and the particular satisfaction of a load placed exactly where it needed to be placed. The vocabulary of a body that knew its job and did it without requiring the rest of the person to fully participate. His mind was elsewhere and his body was not, and this had always been one of his more reliable arrangements. He heard the conversation during the mid-morning break in the narrow shelter between two stacked containers where three of the older dock hands, men who had worked this port for 25 years, men whose knowledge of the port's unofficial operations was as thorough and as carefully maintained as their knowledge of its official ones. gathered in the specific way of people who have been having the same conversation in the same place for so long that they have stopped needing to formally initiate it. He was not part of the conversation. He was near it. He had learned, over his years on this dock, that near was often more informative than inside, that the things people said when they believed they were among a fixed audience were different from the things they said when they registered a new presence. He heard the name CO Brotherhood spoken without lowering, because at this dock, among these men, the Brotherhood was a fact of the environment the way weather was a fact. Something that did not require discretion because discretion implied the possibility of ignorance and no one on this dock was ignorant. He heard the word interpreter and the small, almost imperceptible adjustment he made, the micro-stillness, the holding, was something only he would have known was not simply the stillness of a man resting against a container. He heard a woman described in the offhand language of men who describe women as features of a landscape, as notable weather, sharp and quiet, and the kind of beautiful that a person who knew anything would understand to mean stay away, which was not the same as saying she was dangerous exactly, more that the world she moved inside was dangerous, and the proximity was dangerous, and the Brotherhood had a long history of collecting people with particular gifts and keeping those people in ways that limited their freedom of movement without any formal restriction being required. Marcus listened. The conversation moved on. He did not move with it. He stayed where he was for a moment longer than necessary, looking at the middle distance, which in this case was a stack of green shipping containers beyond which was the harbor, beyond which was the city. And he assembled the pieces with the same part of his mind he used to assemble structural drawings from loose information. This piece connects here, this load transfers there, this wall bears this, and here is where the stress concentrates. Here is the point that the whole structure is organized around whether the structure acknowledges it or not. He knew what the Brotherhood was. He had known what the Brotherhood was since he was 16 years old and watching from the dock where his uncle worked as a freight clerk as a man was quietly and efficiently removed from his employment for asking a question about a manifest that did not match the container it was supposed to correspond to. The man's name had been Lee, and he had been a careful, precise person, and his removal had been so smooth and so complete that within 2 weeks it was as though Lee had never stood at that dock asking his reasonable question at all, and Marcus had understood then, had added it to the accumulating archive of understanding that was the port's actual education, the curriculum beneath the curriculum, that the Brotherhood's real business was not in what it moved, but in what it prevented from being seen. 16 years of working this dock had not revised this understanding. It had deepened it with detail. He climbed back into the crane cab. He did his work. He did not think about what the work meant that he was thinking about, or rather he did not allow the thinking to become explicit, to surface into the kind of formed thought that would require him to do something with it. Not yet. Not here, 70 feet above a dock that had ears for which it had never needed eyes. The Yakuza delegation departed the estate at 3:17 in the afternoon. Ji-yeon knew this because she tracked departures the way she tracked everything in these environments, not with the apparatus of surveillance, but with the quiet, continuous attention of someone who understands that information is the only currency she has in a world where she is not permitted to hold any other. She was conducted back to the car. Choi closed the car door with the particular care of someone who has been trained to perform the gestures of consideration without necessarily possessing its substance. The car moved back through the gate. The gate closed. She sat in the car and looked at her hands in her lap. They were still. She had trained her hands to be still the way she had trained her face and her voice and her breath, and she was grateful for this training right now, because stillness was what was available to her, and stillness would have to be sufficient. The car moved through the afternoon traffic on the road back toward the city, and the city materialized slowly around her. The density of it, the ordinary accumulated noise of people and commerce, and the texture of daily life continuing its daily life with no awareness of the compound on the outskirts, or the meeting in the stone and steel receiving room, or the room in the corridor she had not been shown. And she sat in the middle of all of this ordinariness and felt, for the first time in a very long time, the full dimensional weight of what she had become. She was not just an interpreter. She had known this in the abstract way of a person who knows a thing intellectually and has not yet been required to feel its full mass. She was a witness. She had been a witness for some time now, to the edges of things, to the peripheral events that her role placed her near without placing her inside, and witness is occupied, in the Brotherhood's calculus, a specific and not comfortable position. They were useful until they became liabilities, and the transformation from useful to liability was not announced. It did not come with a meeting or a formal change of status. It came with a door that didn't open, a car that arrived slightly differently than usual, a conversation that stopped at the precise moment she entered a room. She had seen this process applied to others. She had translated, once, a conversation that was in part about the management of information that had strayed beyond its intended container, and the language used had been the careful, business-like language of logistics, and she had translated it faithfully and completely and had understood, in the car afterward, that she was translating instructions about a person the way a surveyor translates contours into a map, with precision, without sentiment, as though the terrain being described were not a human life. She sat in the car and looked at her still hands and understood that she was somewhere in the early stages of the process she had watched others move through. She did not know where in the early stages. She did not know how much time the stages took. She knew that she was inside them, and that the inside of them was not a place designed with her survival as a priority consideration. This was what she carried into the evening. This was the weight she took to the waterfront. Not by plan, she had no plan. She who was organized almost to the level of compulsion. She who planned every surface and every exit, but by the same wordless locomotion that had brought her here 2 nights ago. The body making the decision before the mind had finished its deliberation, the feet knowing what they were going toward before the rest of her was prepared to acknowledge it. She sat on the bench at the harbor's edge. She removed her shoes. She had never done this in public before, removed her shoes on a public bench, set them beside her with the precision of someone who has not fully abandoned her habits even in the act of abandoning her composure. And the concrete was cold against the soles of her feet, and the cold was specific and physical and present, and she was grateful for its specificity the way a person is grateful for any sensation that is simply and purely what it is without subtext or strategy or consequence. She was not crying. She did not cry easily, and she did not cry tonight. She was simply emptied. The word for it in Korean and in English both arrived at the same place, a vessel that had been required to hold too much, for too long, with too little acknowledgement of what holding cost, and that had arrived at a moment of simple structural honesty about its own capacity. She sat with her feet near the water, and the harbor spread before her, and the city's lights made their familiar reflections on the surface of the port, and she breathed carefully, as she did most things. But this time the care was not performance. It was simply the mechanism of a body that had decided to keep going. Marcus came from the direction of the dock road. He was not looking for her. This was true in the way that a compass is not looking for north, The needle moves without intention, without search. And then it stops, and the stopping is not coincidence and not intention, but something in between those two things that does not have a clean name in either of the languages he carried. He saw her from 20 meters away, and his pace did not change, which was perhaps the most honest thing he had done in 2 days. He saw her, and he did not change his pace, and he did not pretend, even internally, that he was going to walk past. What he saw, and the seeing of it moved through him in a way he could not have diagrammed, could not have found the load-bearing structure of, could only register with the full and helpless attention of a person encountering something true. Was not the woman he had met at the night market with her precise posture and her controlled effect and the careful distance she maintained even while speaking directly to him. What he saw was the absence of all of that. He saw the shoes beside her on the bench. He saw the shoulders that had been held, for however many hours, against whatever the day had required, and were no longer held. He saw a woman at the edge of something, not the edge of the water, but the edge of the thing the water was a metaphor for, the edge of the particular kind of exhaustion that comes not from overwork but from sustained vigilance, from the unceasing labor of carrying what cannot be set down and cannot be shared. He recognized it. He did not know her life. He did not know the compound or the receiving room, or the name Park Sung-jin, or the yellow cardigan on a girl reading on a bench outside a building, waiting for her father. He did not know any of the specific contents of what she was carrying. But he knew the carrying. He had seen it in his grandmother's face in the photographs from before she had come to Busan, before she had decided that the crossing was the only answer to a question that was not really a question at all. He had seen it in Deoksu's face on certain mornings when the older man arrived at the dock and looked at the harbor for a long moment before turning to the work. He had felt it himself in the particular way of a man who exists at the intersection of two worlds and belongs completely to neither, who carries the fluency and the fracture of that position in every room he enters. He knew the carrying. And there was something in him, cellular, instinctive, older than thought, that responded to the sight of it in her the way his hands had responded to the falling drawings on the night they first met, the reflex to steady what was falling before he had decided to. He sat beside her. He did not ask. There was nothing to ask. The bench was long enough, and the harbor was wide enough, and the night was doing what the night did, moving the water, moving the light on the water, moving the dark at its own pace toward whatever the morning would decide to be. And he sat in it beside her and set his thermos down between his feet and looked at the same harbor she was looking at, and the silence between them was not the silence of two strangers who have run out of manageable surface to navigate. It was something else. It was the silence of two people who have, without quite agreeing to it, decided to be in the same place at the same time and to stop pretending that this is an accident. Ji-yeon did not speak. She did not perform composure, which was, and this was not a small thing, it was not a small thing at all. It was perhaps the most significant thing that had happened to her in longer than she could easily account for entirely new. There was no face she was holding. There was no space she was managing. There was the harbor and the cold of the concrete beneath her feet and the man beside her who had come and sat without asking and without requiring anything of her, and she breathed, and the breathing was just breathing. Marcus understood, sitting there, that whatever this was, it was not going to be safe. He understood it with the full, clear-eyed cognition of a man who has spent his adult life in close proximity to the mechanics of what the Brotherhood controlled and what that control cost the people inside its orbit. He understood that the woman beside him moved within that orbit, that she was a person of specific usefulness to a world that did not hesitate to consume what it had found useful when the usefulness changed shape. He understood that his wanting to sit beside her was not simply a personal preference, but an entry into a situation that had structural implications, load-bearing implications. The kind of implications that a responsible engineer is supposed to account for before the building goes up rather than after the stress begins to show. He understood all of this. He had understood it on the dock when he heard the word interpreter and felt the recognition move through him. He had been understanding it steadily, in the way of a tide that does not announce itself but is simply there for 2 days. And he sat here now, on this bench, at this harbor, beside this woman who had removed her shoes and was breathing without performing the breathing, and he did not move. He chose to not move. Not from recklessness and not from ignorance, but from something that was neither of those things, a choosing that was eyes open, that held the full weight of what it was choosing into, that said, yes, still, yes anyway, yes. She turned her head and looked at him. Not with question, not with the careful, calibrated looks of their first 2 meetings, the assessments, the withholdings. She looked at him the way a person looks when the looking is simply the looking, when the face behind the eyes is the same as the face that the world sees, and it costs something to allow this, and she allowed it. He looked back. The harbor moved between them and around them and below them, and the city went on with its city life behind them, and neither of them said anything, because there was not yet a language between them adequate to what they were sitting inside. And because sometimes the thing that is felt most fully is the thing that, in the moment of its fullness, requires the least from speech. They stayed, both of them. This was the decision. Not made in words, not announced, not negotiated, but made in the staying, in the choice to remain on the bench as the harbor's darkness deepened and the lights of the port continued their indifferent illumination of the water. 2 nights ago, she had chosen to stay, and that had been one kind of threshold. Tonight they both chose it, and the threshold was different, darker, heavier, more knowing. The lightness of first encounter was gone. What remained was something that had looked at what it was, what it cost, what it risked, what it meant to want something in a world designed to make the wanting dangerous, and had not looked away. Had stayed anyway. Had decided, together and separately and at the same time, that the staying was the answer to the question neither of them had said aloud. The water moved. The night held them. And in the silence between 2 people who had, without planning to, begun the complicated and irreversible business of mattering to each other, the silence was not empty. It was full of everything that had not yet been said, and would be, and of everything that the saying would cost, which they both understood, and neither of them was willing, any longer, to let determine the outcome.